The water came up to their waists, cold, black. October rain hammered the surface of the flooded polder, and beneath it, mud thick as cement pulled at their boots with every step. The men of the 1st Canadian Army could see nothing beyond 100 yards. Fog clung to the canal banks like smoke from a funeral pyre. They moved forward anyway, rifles held above the waterline, breath fogging in the pre-dawn air. Ahead, somewhere in the gray, German machine guns waited. This was the Scheldt Estuary, October 1944, and no one wanted to be here. The ground itself seemed designed to kill. Flooded fields stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by narrow raised dikes that became killing corridors under German artillery fire. Every road was registered, every farm building fortified. The Wehrmacht had 3 weeks to dig in while the Allied High Command looked the other way, chasing glory at Arnhem. Now the Canadians had been handed the bill. Lieutenant General Guy Simons stood in the operations tent at 1st Canadian Army Headquarters, maps spread before him like an autopsy report. He traced the line of the Leopold Canal with one finger. 30 feet wide, dikes on both banks, German positions on the reverse slope, invisible to artillery spotters. He had asked for more divisions. Montgomery had taken them from Market Garden instead. Simons looked at his staff officers and said nothing for a long moment. There was nothing to say. The mission had not changed, only the odds. The port of Antwerp sat 40 miles inland, the 2nd largest harbor in Europe, captured intact on September 4th by British armored units racing through Belgium. 90% of its facilities undamaged, cranes standing, docks empty, warehouses waiting. But the Scheldt Liver, the 60-mile water highway from the North Sea to Antwerp, remained in German hands. Every battery, every fortified island, every flooded kilometer controlled by Wehrmacht forces who had been given one order from Adolf Hitler himself: hold the Scheldt at all costs, deny the Allies this port. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance would starve. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery knew this. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commander of Allied naval forces, had been saying it since September 5th. He told Montgomery that as long as the Germans held the mouth of the Scheldt, Antwerp would be as useful as Timbuktu. But Montgomery was focused elsewhere. Operation Market Garden, the bridge at Arnhem, the thrust into Germany, glory before logistics. So the Canadian First Army, battered from weeks of clearing French Channel ports, was told to wait. The Germans did not wait. General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, commanding the 15th Army, used those 3 weeks to turn the Scheldt into a fortress. By early October, the strategic situation had clarified into a brutal equation. The Allied armies, stretched across France and Belgium, were running out of supplies, fuel, ammunition, food. The ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre were hundreds of miles behind the front lines. Trucks wore out, convoys slowed. Divisions went on half rations. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, staff officers calculated tonnages and knew the numbers did not work. Without Antwerp, the war would bog down. The advance into Germany would halt. Winter would come, and the Wehrmacht, given time to regroup, would harden its defenses along the Rhine. On October 9, 1944, Admiral Bertram Ramsay went directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He told Eisenhower that the Canadians were rationing ammunition, that Montgomery was prioritizing the Arnhem salient over opening Antwerp, that the 1st Canadian Army could not attack until November without resupply. Eisenhower, his patience finally exhausted, sent a message to Montgomery that same day. "The supreme importance of Antwerp," he wrote. "It is reported to me this morning by the Navy that the Canadian Army will not, repeat not, be able to attack until November unless immediately supplied with ammunition." Montgomery bristled at the intervention. He wrote Dak asking by what authority Ramsay made statements about operations he knew nothing about. "There is no shortage of ammunition," Montgomery insisted. "The operations are receiving my personal attention." But the message had been delivered. The priority had shifted. On October 16th, Montgomery issued a new directive. Antwerp, he declared, was now top priority for all operations of 21st Army Group. By then, the Canadians were already fighting. The men crossing the Leopold Canal on the morning of October 6th were from the 7th Infantry Brigade, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the Regina Rifles, the Canadian Scottish Regiment, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, battalions recruited from the western provinces, men who knew cold and mud and hardship. They had landed on Juno Beach on D-Day, fought through Normandy, cleared the channel ports at Boulogne and Calais. They were veterans. They knew what was coming. The assault plan relied on flamethrowers. Wasp armored carriers would spray liquid fire across the canal, incinerating the German defenders in their positions on the far bank. Then the infantry would cross in assault boats, establish a foothold, and push inland. Simmons knew the plan was thin. He had been told the German 64th Infantry Division was under strength and demoralized. Intelligence suggested they might retreat once the attack began. Intelligence was wrong. General Knut Eberding commanded the 64th Division, an Eastern Front veteran, an expert in defensive warfare. He had 11,000 men dug into positions south of the Scheldt in what would become known as the Breskens Pocket. 500 machine guns, 200 anti-tank guns, 70 artillery pieces, 120mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed as infantry shredders. 3 weeks of fortification, 3 weeks to register every road, every dike, every approach with his guns. He had orders to fight to the death. He issued orders that any soldier retreating without permission would be executed. Their families would be named enemies of the German people. The flamethrowers worked for the first 30 seconds. Sheets of fire arced across the Leopold Canal, silhouetting the assault boats as they pushed off from the near bank. Men paddled hard, hunched low. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The 20mm guns tore through the assault boats like paper. Mortar rounds walked across the water. Artillery shells burst on the canal banks. The Royal Montreal Regiment, new to combat and eager, lost an entire company within minutes. Men drowned in the canal. Men burned. Men crawled up the far bank into positions still occupied by Germans who had survived the flames. The Regina Rifles made it across. So did the Canadian Scottish. By midday, they had 2 small bridgeheads, separated, barely holding. The Germans counterattacked immediately. Eberding was not content to simply stop the Canadians. He intended to annihilate them. For the next 68 hours, the 7th Brigade clung to the far bank of the Leopold Canal, while German infantry and artillery tried to push them back into the water. Supply was impossible. Reinforcement was suicide. Slit trenches filled with water and had to be dug out repeatedly. Men crouched in the mud, rifles jammed with filth, waiting for the next counterattack. On October 9th, a second Canadian force, the 9th Infantry Brigade, launched an amphibious assault across the Scheldt estuary itself, landing at Hoofdplaat behind German lines. They crossed at night in Buffalo amphibious vehicles, guided by a Royal Navy lieutenant who piloted them through the dark water without lights. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders landed without resistance and captured 9 sleeping Germans in a dugout. For an hour, they thought the war might be easy here. Then the Wehrmacht arrived. Eberding sent his reserves south immediately. Model, commanding Army Group B, recognized the threat and ordered Eberding to annihilate the Highland Brigade. German counterattacks came in waves. The Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders fought for 2 days to hold the village of Hoofdplaat. 17 dead, 44 wounded. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders took 3 days to capture the village of Driewagen, their war diary noting that the enemy were a much better type than we have been running into lately. Canadian artillery, among the best in the world, fired continuously, breaking up German attacks by day. At night, German infantry infiltrated Canadian positions, and brutal close-quarters fighting erupted in the dark. The ground itself was the enemy.
Polderland, reclaimed from the sea, sitting below sea level, kept dry by dikes and drainage canals. The Germans had blown the dikes. Water covered the fields. Only the raised roads remained passable, and the Germans had every road zeroed in with artillery and mortars. Tanks could not maneuver. Infantry had to advance in single file along the dikes, exposed, silhouetted against the sky. One German machine gunner could stop an entire company. Canadian casualties mounted. Replacements were scarce. Prime Minister Mackenzie King had promised no overseas conscription, and volunteers were running out.
At the Leopold Canal, the 7th Brigade was still holding its bridgehead after 5 days. On October 12th, engineers managed to build a bridge strong enough for tanks. Reinforcements crossed. The bridgehead expanded, but the fighting did not ease. Canadian historians Terry Kopp and Robert Vogel would later write that veterans insisted the fighting at the Leopold Canal was worse than the blackest days of Normandy. The War Diary of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles reported that the ground was littered with both German and Royal Winnipeg Rifle dead. In terms of percentage losses, the Battle of the Leopold Canal was one of the bloodiest actions Canada fought in the entire war. 533 killed. 70 more broke down under battle exhaustion, curling into fetal positions, unable to speak or move. 15 miles to the east, another Canadian force was fighting for a different objective. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had been tasked with sealing off the South Beveland Peninsula, cutting the land route to Walcheren. The approach was a narrow isthmus at Woensdrecht, barely a mile wide, flanked by flooded polders. The Germans held the high ground. Not high by any reasonable standard, just a low ridge of sand and heath, but in the flatness of the polder country, it was enough. From those heights, German observers could see everything that moved below. On October 7th, the Calgary Highlanders and the Black Watch of Canada advanced toward Woensdrecht. German resistance was immediate and ferocious. Kampfgruppe Chill, a battle group built from the remnants of shattered divisions, had been rushed to the sector. The 6th Parachute Regiment, elite German airborne troops fighting as infantry, dug in around the village. They had tanks, self-propelled guns, orders from Field Marshal Model to hold the corridor to Walcheren open at any price. The Canadians attacked through rain and fog, across open ground, under machine gun and artillery fire. They took the village of Hoogerheide in bitter house-to-house fighting. They pushed toward Woensdrecht. The Germans counterattacked, again and again. On October 13th came Black Friday. The Black Watch, a regiment drawn from Montreal's Scottish elite, was ordered to attack German positions southwest of Woensdrecht. The plan was simple and doomed. 2 companies would advance in daylight over 1,000 yards of open polder, flanked by dikes full of German infantry, with tanks unable to follow due to flooded ground. Fog obscured vision. The Canadians could not see to fire. The Germans, with pre-registered positions, did not need to see. Machine guns opened up. Artillery walked through the Canadian ranks. Mortars dropped among the advancing men. The Black Watch charged anyway. 2 hours, 183 casualties. No ground gained. That evening, another attack. Same result. The regiment was nearly destroyed. 3 days later, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, known as the Rileys, attacked Woensdrecht at night. Supported by 168 artillery pieces and tanks, they stormed the village and took it. German counterattacks followed immediately. The 6th Parachute Regiment overran a forward Canadian company. The Hamiltons called artillery fire down on their own position. 5 minutes of hurricane bombardment. The Germans, caught in the open, were annihilated. For 5 more days, the Rileys held Woensdrecht, beating off attacks, clearing snipers from the rubble. They lost 167 men killed. By October 23rd, the land corridor to Walcheren was finally cut. The battle for the Breskens Pocket continued through October. The 3rd Canadian Division advanced slowly, methodically through flooded fields and fortified villages. Eberding's 64th Infantry Division fought with fanatical determination, executing soldiers who retreated. On October 24th, Montgomery visited the headquarters of the 3rd Division and criticized the slow advance, despite the fact that his own decision to prioritize Market Garden had given the Germans 3 weeks to fortify their positions. The 3rd Division was ordered to press on with all speed, casualties be damned. The towns of Breskens, Oostburg, and Zoutsande fell one by one in intense combat. On November 1st, General Eberding himself was captured when the North Nova Scotia Highlanders stormed his command post. Despite his orders to fight to the death, he surrendered without firing a shot. Operation Switchback ended on November 3rd when the last German positions south of the Scheldt were cleared. Walcheren Island remained. Fortress Walcheren, Hitler had called it, the final key to opening Antwerp. A flat, below-sea-level island ringed by dikes, heavily fortified, garrisoned by the German 70th Infantry Division. Coastal batteries and concrete and pavements, artillery positions covering every approach. The RAF had bombed the dikes to flood the interior, leaving only the coastal perimeter dry. The plan to take Walcheren involved 3 simultaneous assaults. Canadian forces would attack across the narrow causeway from South Beveland, British commandos would land at Flushing, and more commandos would assault West Capelle on the western coast. On October 31st, the Black Watch, the same regiment shattered at Woensdrecht, was ordered to test the causeway. It was a ribbon of raised road, 30 feet wide, 1,000 yards long, perfectly straight, with flooded mudflats on either side. No cover, no concealment. Just open ground under German guns. The Black Watch stepped onto the causeway at midday. Machine gun fire, artillery, mortars. They discovered a massive crater blown in the middle of the road, preventing tank support. They pressed forward anyway, taking casualties with every yard. By evening, they had gained a toehold on the western end, but could not advance farther.
On November 1st, Le Régiment de Maisonneuve pushed through the Black Watch and established a small bridgehead on Walcheren. At dawn on the 2nd, they were surrounded. German infantry and tanks moved to crush them. Only the intervention of Allied fighter bombers diving through low clouds to strafe German positions saved the regiment from annihilation. By November 2nd, British forces landing at Flushing and West Capelle had gained footholds. The 52nd Lowland Division, a mountain division recruited from Scotland for its strength and stamina, fought through Walcheren's flooded interior using amphibious vehicles. On November 6th, the town of Middelburg, the last German stronghold, surrendered. The battle for the Scheldt was over. From October 1st to November 8th, the 1st Canadian Army suffered 12,873 casualties, of which 6,367 were Canadian. 703 officers and enlisted men killed, thousands wounded, hundreds missing. The Germans lost 4,100 killed, 16,000 wounded, and 41,000 captured. Minesweepers spent the rest of November clearing 267 mines from the Scheldt. On November 28th, the first Allied convoy entered Antwerp, 18 ships carrying 10,000 tons of supplies. By the end of the war, Antwerp would receive 2.5 million tons of materiel, sustaining the final Allied advance into Germany. On the day the first ships docked, a ceremony was held in Antwerp to celebrate the opening of the port. Representatives from Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters attended, officers from Montgomery's 21st Army Group, officials from the Royal Navy, the Belgian government. No one from the 1st Canadian Army was invited. The Scheldt campaign remains one of the least-known major battles of the Second World War. It was fought in conditions that veterans described as the worst of the entire conflict. Mud, water, cold, rain, flooded ground that drowned the wounded, narrow dikes that became shooting galleries, an enemy given weeks to prepare and ordered to die in place. And it was fought by an army that had already been in continuous combat since D-Day, under strength, short of replacements, rationing ammunition while other formations received priority for supply. Eisenhower's message to Montgomery on October 9th, emphasizing the supreme importance of Antwerp, came after weeks of delay. It came after Ramsey's intervention. It came after the Canadians were already committed to operations at Boulogne and Calais. It came too late to prevent the Germans from turning the Scheldt into a fortress, but it came in time to force Montgomery to finally prioritize the mission. The 1st Canadian Army, given an impossible task in impossible terrain, completed it. Without fanfare, without recognition, without an invitation to the ceremony when the port finally opened. In the years after the war, historians would debate the decisions made in September and October 1944. They would analyze Montgomery's focus on Market Garden, Eisenhower's broad front strategy, the failure to close the trap on the German 15th Army, the 3-week delay that allowed von Zangen to fortify the Scheldt. But for the men who fought there, the debates were academic. They had been ordered to take the Scheldt. They took it. The cost was measured in names on grave markers at Adagem and Groesbeck, in hospital wards full of shattered men, in letters sent home to families in Regina and Winnipeg and Montreal and Halifax, in the silence of soldiers who came back and never spoke of the water, the mud, the dikes lined with dead. The Battle of the Scheldt opened the port that sustained the final campaign into Germany. It prevented the Allied advance from stalling through winter. It ensured that when the Rhine was crossed and the Ruhr was encircled and Berlin fell, the armies had the fuel and ammunition and food to finish the war. It was won by soldiers who waded through freezing water and climbed canal banks under fire, and held positions that should have been overrun and advanced across ground that should have been impassable. It was won without the glory of Normandy or the drama of Arnhem. It was won in the mud and the rain and the dark, far from the cameras and the correspondence and the history books that would remember other battles first. Eisenhower called Antwerp supremely important. He was right, but the men who made it possible were not invited to watch the ships arrive.